Are you wanting to paint majestic mountain scenes in oil or acrylic? And that time-old tradition of using a palette knife isn't quite cutting it for you? Well, if you'll follow this video, I'll show you my technique on how I paint realistic mountains. Let's take a look. Everyone seems to love the mountains, whether it's for perspective and scale or tranquility and solitude. There's just something appealing about these majestic landmarks. So there's no wonder why we as artists are drawn to the desire to paint them. Now, when it comes to painting mountains, the number one consideration we should give is to atmospheric perspective. And while this applies to all painting, it's even more so with mountainscapes. The three general rules of thumb with atmospheric perspective is contrast decreases with distance, value decreases with distance, and color shifts with distance. Let me see if I can't illustrate the last two a bit better for everyone. Here we have a typical value chart. With atmospheric perspective, things in the foreground will be towards the bottom of the scale, whereas those things in the distance will be at the top. So as we're painting, our values will change as things go out into the distance. They'll become darker in the foreground and lighter in the background. Okay, let's add a color wheel. So when it comes to color, recall that distance causes shift. That is to say that in the foreground, most colors are visible, but as we add distance, viewable colors shift around the color wheel. Within distance, color starts to drop off the viewable spectrum. The first of which is yellow, then red, and finally only blue is visible. This is why, from a distance, mountains always look blue. Okay, if you made it this far, you're probably asking yourself, having read the About Me section, what does this Florida boy know about painting mountains? Well, before we actually look into the painting process, let me just give you some examples of the work I've done in the past few years. And then after it all, you be the judge. Okay, if you've watched any of my videos before, then you know that I consider the block-in the most critical step in my painting process. If you don't know that, then might I suggest this video linked above. Nevertheless, we'll run through the block-in process so we can get to the next phase and then start to build up the details in the final phase. The modeling phase, as I've discussed in other videos, is the time where I'll take the block in and readjust my colors, sometimes readjust the shapes just according to what is needed for the scene. But it's really a time to really color correct and correct the things that I want to see finalized when we place over the final details. The block-in is great for giving us the general shape and the big colors and everything, but it is truly where the modeling comes in, or the modeling phase, when we start to really see the scene shape up how we want it to be for the final cut. It's during this modeling phase where we really start to implement the aspects that we talked about earlier with the atmospheric perspective. We got to start grading our value, we got to start grading our color, and we got to start grading the contrast. And while we didn't talk about the contrast too much, it's basically simple that things in the background are going to be less detailed than things in the foreground. And finally, we get to the details, the part that everyone loves to see. It's also the part that separates my work from a lot of other artists. There's a lot to be said about the details phase. In fact, you could spend hours upon hours in this phase painting a little detail here and there. But for the sake of this video, I would like to just share a few things with you with regards to the details phase that I'll hold true through every painting that I do, whether it be a mountainscape, landscape, or seascape. The first thing that I hold true to within the details phase is that as long as I've got a solid foundation with my block-in, I've modeled out color and shapes in the modeling phase, there's no reason for me to add color or shapes to the details phase. More so, the details is all about adding those lights and those shadows in areas to make about that 3D shape. I handle this in almost complete opposite manners. With regards to the lights, I generally like to use a little bit of a thicker paint. Remember, we're not trying to change the overall color of the object. We're just shooting to bring about those highlights in our subject. For that, I'll use a thicker paint, sometimes even a impasto medium to the mix, so that it can pop off the canvas a little bit better. In opposition to that, with the shadows and the darks highlights, or the details, I'll use a thinner paint. In fact, I'm almost using a glaze technique. I'll add more medium to the mix. In this case, it's always going to be Liquid Original, but it's almost like a thin wash to go over the already solid foundation of the modeling. And what this achieves was it darkens the modeling color without making it a big bold area that stands out. So we're able to come through and just shadow in areas with the glaze, whereas if we were just to use the thick paint, it would stand out like a sore thumb. Now keep in mind, we're not adding any new color mixes to this phase or these techniques. We're going to be using the same colors that we used in the modeling phase. We're just going to apply the concepts of the atmospheric perspective to them. For example, let me point out our snow in the scene. We have a couple different instances where the snow is on the peaks of the mountains. One that's way far in the distance, another one a little bit closer, and then finally we have the one center of our scene. With the atmospheric perspective, we're going to have a change in that color tone. That closer mountain is going to be a little bit more on the white side. Number one, it's in direct sunlight, but also because it's closer, whereas the far distance mountain, that color needs to get a little bit more muted, a little desaturated as we go back. So with white and the snow, that may even turn into a gray or a bluish gray in the distance. Here's a good example of adding shadow to a subject. Remember, we're using the glazing technique. The paint appears to be darker, but it's actually just adding value to the shadow side of this mountain peak. Let's go ahead and speed up the process so we can get to the end results. Well, as you can tell, we've got a long way to go before we can call this painting complete, but hopefully this little glimpse into my techniques on how I paint the mountains has inspired you to get out there and paint your own. As always, if you're not subscribed to the channel, I'd love for you to partake in our community, so consider a subscription. If you found the content inspiring, the biggest way to support the channel is by liking and sharing the video. I'm always open to questions and critiques, so leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see. And until next time, happy painting.